G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 9 in my series of partial book readings of Tim Bowden's biography of the combat cameraman Neil Davis. I think of him as the quintessential combat cameraman. 21 years in combat, 11 years of it in Vietnam. Okay, to take up the story, I'll reread the previous last paragraph. The Americans were using a soccer field as an emergency landing zone for their helicopters to take out the dead and wounded. Davis and Burgess reasoned that they could get from there to the northern part of Hue, which was being heavily bombed as both the Americans and the South Vietnamese tried to fight their way back into the city. At about 4 p.m, we saw a small artillery spotter plane, a Cessna, shot down. It crashed very close to the soccer field, and just before dusk they brought in what was left of the pilot. There was little more than a charred skeleton wrapped in a plastic bag, which was placed inside one of the bigger regulation body bags. By this time, the Americans in Vietnam had the best of everything, and their body bags were heavy rubberized plastic with zips. They were about 7 feet, just over 2 metres long, and could stand on their own like a collapsible coffin. The two Australians knew they would not be able to move away from the soccer field until morning, if then. They had a little 2-man pup tent and tried to make the best of the situation. The climate in the north of Vietnam in February could be quite cold. Davis knew this and had brought his sleeping bag. From his quilted comfort, Davis said a cheery good night to Burgess. Burgess was dressed in light cotton tropical gear, and by 8:30 p.m. he was getting very cold. Burgess disputes the fine detail of this story, but Davis was adamant. I heard Pat say, "Well, father, at least that pilot's warm out there." It was just a passing remark, and I didn't take much notice. Then, at 11, I heard him flapping his arms and muttering something about having to get warm somehow. I was half asleep by then, and I heard a kind of a dragging sound. I thought I knew what it was, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of a long zip being pulled open, followed by a crackle of plastic as an object was lifted and moved. Then there was some rustling and grunting of Pat settling down for the night, and the zip sound again, and I knew he was in the body bag. Pat did have the grace to go through the whole thing in reverse just before first light. The zip sound again, the rustle of plastic, and a few thumps as the remains of the pilot went back, another zipping sound, and the scraping noise as the body bag went back to the stack. Pat was always reticent about that, but he had a good warm sleep anyway. Next morning, they hitched a lift to the northern part of Hue on a helicopter that had delivered its latest load of dead and dying men. They took only 7 hits on the short flight, which the pilot said was lucky. Davis and Burgess joined a pilot of 20 South Vietnamese soldiers under the command of an Australian warrant officer, Terry Egan, one of the military advisors assigned to the ARVN in various parts of the country. We went out with this patrol onto the streets, and it was really like being one bubble in a glass of soda water. The situation was so fluid. The bubble next to you could be a South Vietnamese or American soldier, or it could be a North Vietnamese. That was the situation in Hue, with these bubbles, these little units of men moving about. There was no water in the pipes, and food was scarce. They had some canteens of water and American tinned field rations, but after 2 days holed up in a partly bombed house, with their unit exchanging fire with a North Vietnamese patrol at the other end of the street, supplies were short. Into no man's land at this time walked a large, strapping pig. Firing on both sides stopped instantly, and communists and capitalists began willing this potential banquet to walk not only their way, but close enough to be shot and retrieved. If it was killed too far away, neither side would get it. The atmosphere was taut with projected willpower. This fine baconer actually started to move towards our side when it stopped and looked around. Pigs can be alert and almost human in some of their reactions. Then we noticed the dead and decomposing body of a North Vietnamese soldier lying on the side of the street. The pig hesitated, looked one way and then the other, turned as if he was going to come our way again, and then darted across the road and drove its snout into the putrid mess of the dead body. It was a ghastly thing to see, and one of our soldiers aimed and shot the pig through the head. It dropped dead right over the body of the North Vietnamese. Immediately there was an outcry. Even from the other end of the block, we could hear the North Vietnamese obviously saying, "Oh my God, what have you done?" Our soldier defended his action by saying that if the pig had been eaten, we would have been cannibals because the pig had been feeding from a fellow Vietnamese. Reluctantly, the soldiers agreed with his argument. The desire for roast pork had disappeared, but food of some kind had to be found. A foraging party went off and met a group from the North Vietnamese held area doing the same thing. Hungry enemies eyed each other off and got on with their scrounging and left the shooting until later. Someone brought back a bottle of Japanese whiskey called Gold King. I never saw it anywhere again, but it was just dreadful. As we had very little water or anything else, we drank it. It was about 1 a.m. and it gave me an instant headache. Despite that, the Gold King party went on. The group was joined by another correspondent, Beverly Dieppe of the Christian Science Monitor, who didn't drink alcohol and who settled herself down in a corner to sleep. Beverly was a very fine correspondent, and we were delighted to have her with us. Meanwhile, the Australian warrant officer, Terry Egan, Pat, and I finished off the Gold King, and we were wondering how to fill in the rest of the night when Pat Burgess had a bright idea. "Hey, Beverly! Beverly, wake up!" he kept shouting, and Beverly thought it best to ignore him. Perhaps, she thought, she was about to be propositioned by this Australian monster. Pat kept going. "Beverly, you work for the Christian Science Monitor, don't you?" Still not a sound from the corner. "Well, come and turn this bloody water into wine then." Burgess was glad he had the water in the morning for his teeth cleaning ritual. Davis thought it wasteful of the little water they had and told Burgess it was dangerous to clean his teeth anyway. He was right. While the big Australian was out in the little courtyard of the house scrubbing and foaming away, Neil heard the unmistakable plop of a mortar shell being launched. 3 things happened at once. I yelled out, the mortar exploded in the courtyard, and Pat crashed in the door, frothing at the mouth with toothpaste. He was spread-eagled at my feet in a cloud of dust and debris, having missed death by a fraction of a second. I said, "Told you it was dangerous to clean your teeth in the morning." He never did it again, on that trip, anyway. Davis's work diaries for the next 3 days are masterpieces of understatement. And they are too. And in the next episode of the series, episode 10, I will get back to them. But at the moment, here endeth episode 9 of the partial book reading of One Crowded Hour, the biography of Neil Davis, written by Tim Bowden. Ciao.